Thank you, Michelle, and the FEE team as well. I'm so excited to be doing this webinar with you all because this happens to be my favorite econ topic. I mean, I love economic literacy in general, but economic institutions, that's where my heart and soul is, and during this webinar, you'll figure out why. So what do I mean when I say economic institutions to begin with? What do I mean by institutions? Think of that as just being the rules of the game. And that's important, right? Because the rules of the game are going to shape our incentive structures, and that's going to lead to, a whole bunch of different outcomes. So getting the rules of the game correct, getting them right, getting those economic institutions correct is extremely important. Okay, so let's get started with our economic institutions and why they matter webinar. Okay, take a look at this map. Some of you might already be familiar with today's topic, and if that's the case, wonderful. But I'd say quite a few of you hopping on might not be familiar with the topic today. So take a look at this map and think to yourself, what does it represent? Try to figure out, or just try to, have a hypothesis of what you think this map might be representing. Now you can see that there are 4 different colors depicted. We see blue countries, we see green countries, we see countries in orange, and countries in red. So kind of focus in on that and, start launching a few hypotheses within your own head to think, what might this map be trying to tell us? Take a look at which countries are blue, which ones you see that are green. What might they have in common? Look at the orange ones and take a look at the red ones and think, what might they have in common? Okay, so what this is actually showing us are the most free to the least free in terms of economic institutions, the countries around the world. So most people, when they look at that map, they probably guess income quite a bit of the time if they're not familiar with this topic. But that map was actually not a representation of income levels. We can go back and you can see why some people might think that. The blue countries tend to be, the wealthy countries. We look at the red countries and we think, okay, those tend to be the poor countries. So you can see why students or educators alike might hypothesize, okay, it's representing income. But no, it's actually representing economic freedom. We'll see in a little bit that there is a very strong correlation between these two things. So it's no wonder that, sometimes people hypothesize that it's income, but it's actually measuring something that we call economic freedom. Okay, so what is economic freedom? This concept is so broad, right? So what are the cornerstones of economic freedom? Meaning what are the main concepts that this is representing? So we have personal choice, voluntary exchange coordinated by markets, freedom to enter in and compete in markets, and also protection of people and their private property rights from the aggression of others. So that might mean, protecting people and their private property from your neighbors nearby, from other individuals, other citizens. They can't come and steal your property, but also, the government, knowing that you have strong private property rights and that the government can't just come in, swoop in, and take your private property. Okay. So this is what economic freedom represents. Now, for a long time, economists thought these things are really important, right? But they didn't have a way to measure it. And, if something's worth looking into and researching, it's worth having a statistical measure so that way we can actually do studies and economic analysis to see, okay, is economic freedom truly impacting all these other well-being measures that we care about? Is it truly impacting those? Okay, so if we are able to develop a measure, a statistical measure for this, then that will really help in future studies. And that's exactly what a couple of economists did back in the 1980s and 1990s. So they created what's called the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which is published by the Fraser Institute up in Vancouver, Canada. And the goal, back when they were creating this index, their goal was to develop a method of measuring that complex concept we just talked about, economic freedom, in order to establish country-specific data on economic institutions which can be utilized and studied in empirical research. So we want to be able to do cross-country analysis, right? And so to do that, we need this statistical measure. So the origin, again, this was back around the 1980s, 1990s. There was a series of conferences. My own colleague, Dr. James Gortney, at the Stavros Center at Florida State University as well, he was one of the original people that was involved in creating this index, and then a few others, hopped on board as well, and they created the Economic Freedom of the World Index. James Gortney, Robert Lawson, Joshua Hall, and there are also other individuals involved in the project now too. So Economic Freedom of the World, we abbreviate it EFW. So if you hear me saying EFW throughout this webinar, this is what I'm talking about. The EFW Index is 43 distinct variables comprised within the index as a whole, and those 43 distinct variables are split up into 5 main areas of the EFW Index. So these main areas are size of government. This includes expenditures, taxes, enterprise. Okay, so for this one, think of it this way. The larger the size of government in general, then the less personal choice that individuals in that country have, because the more that's being decided collectively, the less personal choice the individuals have. So the larger the size of government, the less economic freedom a country is going to have. Okay, let's take a look at the next category. Number 2, legal system and property rights. Okay, this is honestly the most important area out of all 5, in my opinion, and also research shows this as well. Countries can get the other 4 right, if you will. They can have good economic institutions in the other 4 categories, and if they don't have area number 2 right, if they don't get their legal system and property rights super secure, then we see those countries flounder anyway, even if they do pretty well in the other 4 categories. So area 2 is super, super important. The legal system. Are the contracts being enforced even-handedly? Do you have a court system that you can rely upon? Are you worried that, government's going to come in and confiscate your property, or can your neighbor come and take something that's not theirs? And do you have any recourse? Okay, so legal system and property rights are super, super important because it's going to shape our incentives. You're not going to be incentivized to go produce and engage in productive activities, grow crops, or whatever it might be. You're not going to be incentivized to do that if you think somebody else can just come and take it from you and you won't be able to do anything about it. So area 2, extremely, extremely important. Okay, so what about area 3? Access to sound money. Okay, so it is also very important that you can rely upon the currency in your country. If you have rapid inflation rates in your country, we can think of Venezuela, if you have rapid rates of inflation, then it's hitting you on all ends. Not only do you not know how to account for, your money from day to day to day, but especially thinking of future investments, who is going to want to invest in something that might be like a year out, 2 years out, a 5-year project? Who is going to want to invest if they can't rely upon what their currency is going to be worth the next day or the next week? They're certainly not going to take a venture that is, a few years out. So having access to sound money is also super important for a country and for incentive structures. Number 4, area 4, freedom to trade internationally. We know that gains from trade is good, right? Voluntary exchange. If you move goods and services from individuals who value them less to individuals who value them more, as long as it's a voluntary, mutually beneficial transaction, then that's great. Both parties are winning. It's what we call mutually beneficial voluntary exchange because it's a win-win scenario. And if that's true within a country, It's also true crossing borders, right? So freedom to trade internationally. That means if a country has low to no tariffs, low to no quotas, then they're going to be doing well in the economic freedom within that category. Now, if a country has high tariffs, lots of quotas on their imported goods, okay, then they're not going to be doing well when it comes to economic freedom in area number 4. Okay, let's look at area number 5, regulation of credit, labor, and business. So the more excessive and burdensome regulations are, the harder it is to start up a business, to be able to expand your business, to be able to, freely to cooperate and exchange goods and services and your own labor in a free manner. So the more regulations in an extremely burdensome manner, then that's going to lower the economic freedom in a given country. So if there's minimal regulations of credit, labor, and business markets, then that's going to result in a higher level of economic freedom because the individuals in that country are going to be free to choose. Or do they want to, open up a business? Do they want to use their time and energy and talents toward labor within a given industry? Okay, so those are the 5 main areas. We can also look at, this is a screenshot from the EFW 2019 annual report. You can see that I have them all right here for those of you tuning in live, and you can see the video. Got all my EFW indexes here, and within that latest edition, 2019, we can see some of the variables within the first 3 areas of the index, and then we can also see a few more within area 4 and area 5 of the index. And if you, I know we are having to scoot right past that, so if you want to check that out more, just go to the Fraser Institute's website and you can download this yourself. Everything's free on the website, free of charge. Okay, so yes, those are the EFW annual reports. It's now coming out annually, and it gives a statistical update on where all the countries lie in terms of economic freedom. So let's do a quick poll based on what you've learned so far in this webinar. So we're going to do a quick poll. I'm going to launch the poll in just a moment. So first I'll read the options to you. Economic freedom can be summarized as the presence of A, political institutions that foster and promote free and fair elections and constrain the behavior of political leaders. B, personal choice, voluntary exchange, coordinated by markets, freedom to enter and compete in markets, and protection of persons and their property from the aggression of others. C, personal freedoms such as freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech. And then answer choice D, both A and B. Okay, so I'm going to launch this poll. And since I've already read off the options for you, hopefully you'll just be able to quickly choose your answer. The first one is A, the second B, the third one C, and the last one, the fourth one is answer choice D, which is both A and B. Oh, this is very interesting. This is neat to see. Okay, so 74% of you have voted. We're going to turn off the poll in about, let's say about 5 seconds. So if you're still thinking on it, go ahead and just enter in your answer, and then I'll let you know the results. So get your answer plugged in if you have not already. We have 81% of the live webinar participants who have voted already. Okay, great. So the good news is the majority of you did get the answer correct. Let's see, I'll share the results with you all. Okay, so the majority of you got it correct. It was answer choice B, personal choice, voluntary exchange coordinated by markets, freedom to enter and compete in markets, and protections of persons and their property from the aggression of others. Okay, so that's what economic freedom is. Let's look at those other answer choices that might have been confusing some of you. So for those who chose both A and B, why was A not correct? A is talking about political institutions and specifically political freedom, while B is talking about economic freedom. So in just a moment, I'm going to go over with you briefly the difference between political and economic freedom, but that's why A was not correct, is because this is describing political freedom. Now, why was C not correct? C, personal freedom such as freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, that's describing civil liberties. So later on in the webinar, we'll see graphs where it's showing economic freedom's relation to other well-being measures, and one of those graphs includes political rights and civil liberties. So we'll take a look at that later on. Okay, so let's see. Yes, and about 62% of you had that question correct, by the way. About 37% of you chose both A and B. But hopefully now you know the difference between political and economic freedom. We're going to dive a little bit more into that right now. Okay, so economic freedom, not the same thing as political freedom, right? So just a quick little recap on the differences. Honestly, I could spend a whole day on this. In fact, I do a teacher workshop series on economic freedom and how to teach it in the classroom with interactive activities and lessons. So I in fact do this type of content in a whole day long workshop. So trying to just compress as much of it as I can into this hour-long webinar. Okay, economic institutions. Those are the legal, regulatory, and social constraints that affect the security of property rights, enforcement of contracts, and one's choice of when and how to participate in exchange. Now, why is that so important when it comes to incentives? Because those economic institutions shape our incentives when it comes to engaging in productive activities, when it comes to gains from trade, realizing gains from trade, when it comes to innovations. And we know that the sources of economic growth are entrepreneurial discovery, investment in physical and human capital, and gains from trade. So it's very important that we get the economic institutions right so that the incentive structure will be set up, the rules of the game will be set up to positively impact all these different incentives of individuals. Okay, so political institutions. How do political institutions differ? Those are the rules that determine political outcomes and establish the sphere of governmental action, such as the method of how political leaders are selected and the constraints on their behavior. Okay, so we just outlined economic institutions versus political institutions. Now, what does it mean if there's economic freedom versus political freedom? Okay, so economic freedom, we've already covered this so far in the webinar. We talked about how the cornerstones are personal choice, voluntary exchange coordinated by markets, freedom to enter in and compete in markets, and also protection of persons and their property from the aggression of others, right? So individuals are free to choose, free to trade, and cooperate with others and compete as they see fit. That is economic freedom. Okay, political freedom, what is that? Political freedom is the presence of political institutions that foster and promote free and fair elections and constrain the behavior of political leaders. So can you see how that's different? A democratic country has high levels of political freedom, while an autocratic country has low levels of political freedom. Okay, just wanted to give that brief overview of the difference for you, because I know that sometimes confuses my own students when they're just starting out and being introduced to this topic. They tend to associate, like these various different elements, and I'll say, no, that's actually political freedom. So just want to clarify that. Now, how does economic freedom impact standards of living? This is why economic freedom is so important, you guys. Okay, so many people out there are trying to solve and cure all these different ailments of the world and around the world, right? Which is good. We want to help our fellow human beings. We want to help solve these problems that we see around the world. Problems like poverty, problems like, literacy rates, problems like gender inequality and women's rights, problems like various different healthcare measures, environmental concerns, like all these problems that people are passionate about. What if I told you that I had the answer to solve like all those things that I just listed? If you get the economic institutions correct, all those other things follow. And that's what I'm about to show you right now. Now, this is like, if you are really comprehending this, you should be so excited, especially once you see the data I'm about to present to you, because this is revolutionary, right? Especially for those who haven't heard it before. Here they are maybe trying to solve all the symptoms of these problems, the symptoms of poverty, solve the source of the poverty. Why is it that people are poor? People are poor because they don't have jobs. Why don't they have jobs? I'm paraphrasing a friend of mine here, but why don't they have jobs? Because the economic institutions in those particular countries are such where the regulations are so burdensome, the individuals aren't able to start up businesses, and therefore there are no jobs. The people remain poor. It's not because they're not hardworking. It's not because they're not smart enough. It's because the economic institutions in their country are constraining their ability to grow and prosper. So this is so important. Okay, so here we looked at this map before, and we saw that the red countries are the least free, the least economically free countries. The orange countries are in the third quartile. The green countries are the second quartile, and the blue countries are the most free, the top quartile of economic freedom. And keep in mind, all I mean by quartile is we're saying if we listed out all the countries measured by the Economic Freedom of the World Index, the bottom 25% is that lowest quartile. The top 25% is in that most free quartile. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's take a look at this data. So this particular graph, if you want to see it after the webinar, you can just go to Exhibit 1.6 within this latest EFW 2019 annual report. Economic freedom and income per capita. So we're looking at GDP per capita. Check this out. So in the most free countries, individuals living in the most free countries have, on average, about 6 times the income levels of the average person in the least free quartile. How incredible is that? So individuals in the least free quartile, on average, are only making about $6,000. This is $6,140 in annual income. Third quartile, they're making about double that, $12,622. Second quartile, they're making about $22,000. Most free quartile, on average, about $36,770. 6 times the income level. Wow. And if that isn't compelling enough, check out what I'm about to show you here. Okay, so this right here should be astounding in itself, honestly. But check this out. So let's ask ourselves 2 questions. If a country has a high degree of economic freedom and maintains it over an extended period of time, will it achieve high income levels? Is this the answer we're looking for? Will it achieve high income levels? The second question, can you achieve high per capita income without having significant amounts of economic freedom? Is it possible for a country with low levels of economic freedom to still have a high income? Is that possible? Okay, well, let's check this out and look at it. Okay, so let's focus in first on that first question. If a country has a high degree of economic freedom and maintains it over an extended period of time, will it achieve high income levels? Another way we can think of this is, does economic freedom guarantee that a country will be able to achieve high income levels? Now, let's examine the economic freedom and per capita GDP of the countries that there was EFW data available for an extended period of time. So we're looking at this from 1995 through 2017 and taking an average of the economic freedom score of the top 25 countries, and then in a moment we'll look at the bottom 25. And so in looking at that, there were 123 countries that was measured by the EFW Index during that extended period of time that we're taking the average from 1995 through 2017. In reality, if you're looking up recent data, there are even more countries measured by the EFW Index. But for this study, we're just looking at those that had data for that extended time period. Okay, so let's check this out. All right, so right now we are looking at countries with the highest average EFW ratings through that extended period of time, 1995 through 2017, and we're looking at the average income, the 2017 figures. And this is already adjusted for purchasing power parity in constant US dollars, so it's already adjusted for that. All right, so we're looking at this list. I'll give you a moment to just check out the countries that you're seeing here in the figures. So this score here, you see in parentheses, that's the EFW rating score. So the higher the score, the better they scored in economic freedom. So this is the summary score for the time period of 1995 through 2017, the average. Okay, and then in this column, you're seeing the average income. And then this right here is the same, top 25 countries. And actually you see 27 because there was a tie for the last slot. There was a tie between Panama, Iceland, Malta, Belgium, Spain, Taiwan, and Norway. So that's why we see 27 rather than the top 25. So that's why you see that. All right. So looking at this, what do we see? This is astounding, you guys. All 27 of these countries had a 2017 per capita GDP of more than $20,000. Wow. Now, in fact, nearly all of them had incomes of at least $30,000. Only 4 countries of the 27 freest economies had a 2017 per capita GDP of less than $30,000. And those 4 countries were Mauritius, Chile, Estonia, and Panama. And the 4 countries that I just listed of per capita GDP of less than 30,000, it was because they were relatively poor at the beginning of the period. They're doing better now. They are catching up rapidly, and all 4 had impressive growth rates during that time period. Okay, what else are we seeing here? Check out how 18 of the 27 countries you see with the most economic freedom have an average income of over $40,000. Wow. Okay, so look at that. Only 3 other countries among the 123 with economic freedom data during that time period had a 2017 per capita GDP of that magnitude that are not on that list. Only 3 other countries reached that are not in this list of top 25. Again, it's really top 27 here. Okay, that is impressive. Now let's look at, well, before we go on to the next question, let's look at the, what we were trying to answer. If a country has a high degree of economic freedom and maintains it over an extended period of time, will it achieve high income levels? And based on looking at the 25, truly 27 due to ties, the freest economies of the world, the answer is yes, all of them. All of them achieved an average annual income greater than $20,000, and most of them, achieved higher than that. Let's look at that second question we ask ourselves. Can you achieve high per capita income without having significant amounts of economic freedom? Another way to phrase this, can a country with little economic freedom nonetheless still achieve a high per capita GDP? Can they still achieve high income levels? Let's look at this data. Okay, so this is showing us the countries with the lowest average EFW ratings from 1995 through 2017. It's taking an average. You can see in the parentheses here the average EFW score. Keep in mind, low scores are bad, right? Low scores are meaning they have low levels of economic freedom. So we can see that all of these have low levels, but especially as we're getting more and more toward the bottom, we can see that Venezuela has the lowest. Okay, we can also see the GDP per capita, the average income for individuals in those countries. Okay, so what are we seeing here? What are we seeing? None of these countries had a 2017 per capita GDP as high as $20,000. None of them. Not one. Not one. Only 4 of the 25, and again, when I was trying to take the top 25, this one ended up being, you see 26 countries in this list, again, because there were ties. But, you know, looking at the top 25, really the top 26, only 4, Gabon, Iran, Algeria, and Venezuela, had a per capita GDP of greater than $10,000. Almost all of them was less than $10,000. And those 4 are major oil exporters. Only one other country, Ukraine, was able to achieve a per capita GDP greater than $6,000. What does this mean? This means 20 of the 25 lowest rated countries had a per capita GDP of less than $6,000. 20 of the 25 lowest rated, the lowest economically free countries, had an average GDP of less than $6,000. Wow. So, to answer our question, can you achieve high per capita income without having a significant amount of economic freedom? Based on looking at those 25 least free economies, really the 26, no. None of them had an income as high as $20,000. In fact, only 4 of them had an income as high as $6,000. Wow. Okay, but let's not just look at average income levels. Let's look at economic freedom and extreme and moderate poverty. You hear a lot of talk nowadays about, income inequality and wealth inequality, and there's such a large, gap and such. Personally, I am more concerned about the poorest of the poor individuals. I am more concerned and most concerned about raising the standards of living for everyone in society and making sure that the poorest of the poor, that they are rising. That's what I'm concerned about. If there are individuals that, are starving and such, let's get their income levels, let's get their standards of living up, and let's go with the source. The source being the economic institutions that are set up to, essentially set up against them. Okay, so let's look at this. Economic freedom and extreme and moderate poverty. So the colors in bold are showing us for the least free quartile, extreme poverty are the colors in bold, and then the paler, softer pastel colors is the moderate poverty rate. And we're seeing this for the least free quartile, the third, the second, and the most free quartile. So as you can see, there's a higher poverty rate in the least free quartile, a much lower poverty rate in terms of both extreme and moderate poverty in the most free quartile. But what are these figures actually telling us? So extreme poverty rate, this is defined by the World Bank. This is from the World Bank Development Indicators. So it's how the World Bank defines extreme poverty and moderate poverty for across the globe. Extreme poverty rate is the percentage of a country's population that lives on $1.90 per day. And that, again, is adjusted for purchasing power parity. Moderate poverty rate, the percentage of a country's population that lives on $3.20 per day. Okay, so check this out. In the least free quartile, nearly half are in moderate poverty. 43% of the population of countries, of individuals living in countries that are in the least economically free quartile, nearly half of them, 43%, are living off of $3.20 or less per day. And about 27% of them are even poorer. About 27% are living off of $1.90 or less per day. Whereas if you are in a country that's in the, most economically free quartile, then only 5.1% of individuals in those countries are living in moderate poverty as defined by the World Bank, and less than 2%, 1.82% living in extreme poverty. So that's a lot lower than what we're seeing here. 27% living in extreme poverty, 43% living in extreme poverty. So that's incredible. That's very compelling. Okay, let's look at this. So here we were looking at poverty rates, extreme and moderate poverty rates as defined by the World Bank. But let's now actually look at the poorest of the poor. So this is looking at the bottom 10%, the poorest 10% in every economy. So the poorest 10% of each country. So in doing this, we can see that the poorest 10% of individuals in countries that fall in the least economically free quartile have on average, or make on average about $1,500 per year. Whereas if you are in a country in the most economically free quartile, then on average, the poorest 10% of individuals in those populations are making about $10,646, which I'm the first one to say that's not much, right? $10,000. If you're watching this on the webinar, I'd say that's less than what you're likely making yourself if you're watching this webinar. So no, $10,000 is not very much, but you know what it is? It's a heck of a lot better than this $1,500 that we see with the least free quartile. So yes, there's room for improvement within this most free quartile. This, can still continue to go up, but it is a heck of a lot better than the individuals that are stuck in the countries with economic institutions that are not consistent with economic freedom. The poorest 10% in those countries are living off of just $1,500 per year of annual income. And what does that mean? That this is the difference between, being poor versus being poor and starving to death. So we can see that there is more than 7 times the poorest 10% of individuals in countries in the most free quartile, even though they're poor, they're only making about $10,000 some dollars, their incomes are more than 7 times higher than individuals in the poorest 10% if you happen to be in a least economically free country. Okay, how about this? Economic freedom and political rights and civil liberties. So this, the political rights and civil liberties figures comes from the Freedom House, Freedom in the World, Freedom House data set, not to be confused with the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World, different data sets. So as we discussed before, political rights and economic freedom, not the same thing. So political rights and civil liberties as measured by Freedom House are measured on a 1 to 7 scale. And I'll just point out, note the inverted scale. So 1 is highest degree of political rights and civil liberties, 7 is the lowest. Normally in the average index, you normally see that you have more of something when the number's going up. So since that scale's inverted, I went ahead and also, inverted the axis so it visually makes sense for you as well. So this most free quartile, we can see that they have both higher political rights, which we're talking about free and fair elections, and higher amounts of civil liberties. So those are those personal freedoms like freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. They have higher political rights and higher civil liberties, greater amounts of it, than individuals in the least free quartile. So if you care about these things too, if you care about political rights and civil liberties, then this is a pretty compelling graph as well. So let's move on to the next one. Economic freedom and gender inequality. I know that a few people on this webinar, at least a few, probably quite a few of you on this webinar care about women's rights and gender inequality. So this gender inequality index is measured by the United Nations Development Program, and it reflects gender-based disadvantage in 3 dimensions: reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market. And it ranges from 0 to 1. 0 would mean that women and men are fair equally, whereas 1 means that there's one gender that fares as poorly as possible in all measured dimensions. So they're more equal if it's toward 0. And what do we see? The most free quartile, the most economically free quartile, has the least amount of gender inequality which is good. It means they're more equal. The women and the men are more equal in the most free quartile. The least free quartile we see has the highest, and by free I mean economically free, the least economically free quartile we see has the greatest amount of gender inequality, meaning that the men and the women are not equal in those societies. Okay, I could delve into this further as well because there is a whole lot of data surrounding gender inequality and surrounding women's rights and such, and I'll show you a few other good resources toward the end of this webinar when I hop over to the Fraser Institute's website, and so you can look into that more if you'd like. Now this one, economic freedom and happiness. Happiness is measured by the United Nations World Happiness Report, and we can see that individuals in countries that are most economically free, they also, the survey reports say that they are happier, that they live happier lives than individuals with lower amounts of economic freedom. And happiness is important too. We all want to live a happy life, right? Okay, now I saved this one for last, economic freedom and life expectancy. So far, prior to this graph, we've been talking about the quality of life, which is extremely important. The quality of life, standards of living, all the well-being measures we've talked about so far have to do with the quality of life. Extremely important. But it's not just the quality of life that we should be concerned about. It's not just the quality that's important. It's also literally the quantity of life. How many years are you living? The quantity of life is also extremely important. And what do we see? We see that people are living longer if they're in a country that's in the most free quartile. They live to almost 80 on average. So the average person in the most free quartile, it shows, lives to be over 79. So that's almost 80. Whereas the average person in the least free quartile, as far as life expectancy at birth, 65 years old. That's about a 15-year gap, right? About a 15-year gap. As one of the co-authors of the EFW Index likes to say, Bob Lawson, he points out quite a bit that is the difference between getting to know your grandchildren or not. That 15 years matters. And so, it's definitely important to be looking at those quality of life statistics that we did earlier, but let's not forget that the quantity of life matters too. People are living longer if they're in countries that are economically free. Okay, so now we can take a moment to explore the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom website. This is the link. If you want to go there later yourself, this is the link, fraserinstitute.org/economic freedom. To be honest, what I normally do is I normally just plug into Google Free the World, because that's what their website used to be before they came up with this beautiful interface that I'm about to show you right now. It's amazing. But that freetheworld.com still forwards on to this new site. So if you can't remember this, just Google freetheworld.com. It'll pop right up. Okay, so let me show you this. And I encourage you to make good use of this. So if you are a student, if you are a teacher, an educator, and even if you're not, maybe you're a researcher, or maybe you're just like an average person tuning into this webinar and you're not even in the field of you're not in the field of education, that's fine too. I encourage you to explore this website and check out, the different areas that you're most concerned about. So I'm going to play this thing for you first. This is going to show you the economic freedoms in countries changing over time. So it's going to go from 1970 through 2017 once I push play. Okay, so here we can see 1985, 1990, 95, 2000, and now it's starting to go annually. So 2005, 6, 7, 8, 2009. So we can see the economic freedom of countries changing. Sometimes they go back and forth between various different quartiles, but on the whole, what were we seeing? Some countries were regressing, but on the whole, we were seeing that countries were becoming more free, more economically free, which is a great thing. We don't have time to, go into a lot of detail as far as all the various features of this site, but I do want to show you a couple of things. Say you want to just really quickly compare a couple of different countries, up to 5 countries. Okay, so I can type in United States, and I might want to type in France, and I might want to type in China and Venezuela. Okay, so what do we see? I just chose a country, one of them in the most free quartile, another one in the second quartile, the third quartile, and the least free, the fourth quartile. And we can see that it easily provides us all of the summary statistics and everything in this area on the left-hand side. So it gives us the country info, it tells us the quartile it's in, the summary rating of the most recent EFW report, the summary rating once all 5 areas are taken into account, but it also breaks it up for us. Those 5 main areas of the EFW index that I explained in the beginning of this webinar, it breaks that up for us as well. So we can see how it ranks in the actual EFW score for size of government, or for legal system and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, regulation. And this is great because keep in mind, even if a country has the exact same EFW score, it's not like those countries actually look exactly the same. They're going to, the various different areas and variables comprised in the EFW index, they're still going to be different within those 5 areas. So you can look and see and compare how the different components are within various different countries. Okay, so that's great to look at. You can also go and make graphs. You can look at the data set. Now this data set page is very helpful if you're wanting to look up, okay, I'm going to X out of those countries I just chose because I want it to show us the full list again. So I'm just going to click X. Okay, so I'm just Xing out so that way it shows us the full list. And there we go. Okay, so now the full list is back up. And this is really, really handy because if you're just wanting to quickly be able to look at something in terms of one of the main areas rather than the index as a whole, you can decide how you want to organize, how you want the data set to be organized for you. So right now it's organized by the overall rank of the EFW index, but maybe you want to organize it by size of government. Maybe you want to organize it by legal system and property rights, or sound money, or freedom to trade internationally. See, you can alter it, and also keep in mind you can look at specific years. So you can go back in time. You can download the full data set. So if you want to do your own research, download that Excel file, do a cross-country analysis, do your own research. And speaking of research, before I head back to the presentation so we can do a Q&A, I just want to also show you that if you click on research and publications, you have a lot of other great reports and resources here. So women's economic rights. My friend and previous colleague, she used to be at the Stavros Center at FSU while she was finishing her dissertation, and now she's in Texas. She's doing great work in terms of the Women in Progress report. So you might want to check that out. You can also download the actual EFW annual report here, read the full publication. You can download that PDF, and you can download previous reports as well. So if you are interested in reading research that is peer-reviewed, then you can go to, let's see, methodology and then citations. So right here, methodology and then citations. And then you can download this Excel or PDF files. And for most of them, it actually includes links directly to the individual studies. So you can get lots and lots of peer-reviewed content. Okay, so I am going to head back to the PowerPoint. Let's see, here we go. Okay, and before we jump on the Q&A portion, I just want to say, if you enjoyed this webinar, feel free to follow any of the following, to like any of the following pages on Facebook. I have my own page. It's just my first name, Signè. Post econ content there. FEE is always producing great content. So the Foundation for Economic Education, you can like FEE. And then also the Stavros Center, the FSU Stavros Center. I man that Facebook page as well, and there's great econ content there that I'm sharing too. And if you are an educator, I realize there's students, teachers, all different types on this webinar right now. If you're an educator, also know that there are more webinar opportunities available to you and your students, and I will actually customize them for your individual class. So for example, here's a list of econ topics. Here's a list of personal finance topics. This is a free of charge service, doesn't cost you any money, and just book a date with me and I will happily customize and personalize a webinar specifically for your class of students. So lots of econ and personal finance topics. Feel free to shoot me an email, sathomas3@fsu.edu if you are interested in any of that. Okay. So questions. I'm going to look at our Q&A and answer a few of the questions that came through during this live webinar. Marina Walters says, regulations are going up here. What is your opinion on this topic? Okay, so regulations, that's area 5 of the EFW Index. When we have a lot of excessive and burdensome regulations, it not only lowers our economic freedom, but it's harmful to the economy and, therefore all those other standards of living that we looked at. A really good example of this is if we look at occupational licensing requirements. Okay, so when occupational licensing requirements are put into place, a lot of times it's put into place with the notion that this is helping consumers. We need to protect consumers. Consumers need protecting, and that's why we are saying that this given industry needs to be licensed. Well, if you actually look at the source of pretty much all of the occupational licensing, the source tends to come from businesses and individuals already practicing within that given industry. They're already up and running, and then they lobby the government saying, okay, we need to place, our own industry needs to be licensed. All these future people coming in now have to go through all these extra hoops. They're already grandfathered in, their own business. They're already in the market working. All these new entries, they need to do all of this testing and such. And again, you might be thinking, oh, it's for the benefit of the consumer. It's to help the consumer. If you look at some of how ridiculous some of these occupational licensing requirements are, even hair braiding, I kid you not, even hair braiding, you can go to the Institute for Justice's website. Even hair braiding is licensed in a lot of states, and the Institute for Justice has been fighting that and been fighting for the freedom of those individuals to practice an honest living, being able to braid hair for a living. And prior to that, the government would come in and even arrest the individuals and say, no, you're operating without a license. You need to be licensed and get a cosmetology degree before you can practice hair braiding. Well, let me rephrase that. You can practice it, but as soon as you start accepting money, as soon as you start creating a business out of it and accepting money, then we're going to shut you down because you don't have a license. Even though the cosmetology schools don't even teach hair braiding. They teach, all these other things. They teach hair cutting and styling and dyeing. They don't even teach hair braiding at all. So that's just one example. There are so many examples of occupational licensing requirements, but we can also think of of business credit and labor restrictions and regulations in the marketplace. All of that is going to hinder one's personal choice and therefore lower economic freedom. So great question, Marina. Okay, so Alexandra Berry asks a great question. She says, can you have economic freedom without political freedom or vice versa? So The second freest economy in the world, the most free for quite a while now has been Hong Kong. The second freest for quite a while has been Singapore. And Singapore is an excellent example of that because they're the second most freest economy. You know, they're in the top quartile, the most free, but we're talking about out of all the countries. They are the second freest out of all the countries. Second most economically free country in the world, Singapore. But they do not have high levels of political freedom. They have low levels of political freedom. So that is a good example of how, you know, countries can have differing levels of freedom in those areas. Webb asks, can you address the myth that Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden are socialist? So if you go back on that Economic Freedom of the World website that I showed you earlier, explore the different components and how they scored within the Scandinavian countries, and you will see that those Scandinavian countries, they're all blue countries. What does blue mean? By the end of this webinar, you should know blue is equivalent to the most free, right? So they might have high levels of like redistribution within their country, redistribution of income, but they are utilizing markets and market forces to allocate the resources in their economy. And in a lot of the different individual variables, they even score better than the U.S. In some of the individual variables. So they actually are a very market-oriented, set of countries. So great question, Webb. Let's see. Okay, so Robert Russell is asking a question, is economic freedom the inverse of political corruption? So first I want to make sure that we're not confusing, economic freedom with political rights or anything like that. But if you're just looking at how it's correlated, how does economic freedom, what's the correlation between economic freedom and political corruption? You do see that countries with higher levels of economic freedom tend to have lower levels of corruption in those countries. Okay, so Daisy Schneider asks, how do we limit regulations for businesses but also make it so that they can't ruin the environment and in their process of whatever they're doing? Okay, so that's a great question. I almost included a slide because I have the graph and the data already. I was having to pick and choose which well-being measures to stick in this hour-long presentation. I almost included a slide that had to do with how economic freedom relates to different environment measures, and we would have seen the same type of correlation. Well, actually, I guess a reverse. We would have seen a negative relationship where there are less environmental harmful things occurring in the countries with more economic freedom. So another way to phrase that, if we would have looked at that graphic as well, we would have seen that countries with more economic freedom have higher amounts of environmentally good policies and outcomes in those countries. Yeah, there are honestly so many good questions on here. I'm like scrolling through, there's so many good ones, but we're now at the very end of our webinar. It's 3 p.m. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, I'm going to say goodbye to you all, just so I'm respectful of everybody's time, but you were asking really great questions. I'm going to be sure to download those, and please be sure to complete the post-webinar survey because we want to hear from you. I definitely want to hear from you. And as a little bonus for completing this webinar and completing the survey, you'll receive a certificate of completion and also bonus readings. So please complete that survey, and I'm definitely interested to know what you personally considered to be the most compelling. So in that last question of the survey, please let me know, like, what resonated with you the most? Which well-being measure, which aspect of the webinar did you find most compelling? And feel free to, shoot me over a question as well. So thank you for attending this webinar, and it's been great spending this past hour with you. Thank you, everyone.